Why did radical Republicans not succeed in changing racial attitudes, culture, and establishing a base for their party? The biggest reason, perhaps, would be the Southern resistance to this. All right, you had what were called redeemer governments down south, the white former slaveocracy down south, thinking they had to, quote, redeem their governments from the tyrannical boot of the North, enforcing this racial equality that was going to ruin the Southern state governments. All right, so local and state governments that ousted Republican governments, that these Southern Democrats that resisted Republican governments at all turns, both legally and extra legally. The Klan pops up during this era. I mean, a few years of white terror down south, terrorizing former slaves and freed blacks into or out of the voting booth and out of offices. As I said, often done through violence and intimidation. That's Nathan Bedford Forrest, Forrest Gump's father, who the Klan begins to terrorize blacks and Republicans down south. Also, don't forget, once we get to the 1870s, in part because of the violence down south, the North begins not feeling as eager to reconstruct the South. All right, they're starting to drink the Kool-Aid the South is serving them. Maybe these freed slaves are incompetent. Look what they're doing down south. They are corrupt and easily duped. Look at all this violence. I want the violence to end. So the white resistance down south was succeeding in that regard. Charles Sumner, an anti-slavery senator, dies in 1874. The Panic of 1873, makes the Republican Party look bad. Many begin to call for a smaller government. You also begin to see, because of the panic, there's less of a tax base coming in. And remember, Reconstruction ain't free, so the North becomes less willing to pay for Reconstruction. And this is also, remember, we didn't get to this yet, but this is also the rise of big business. Everything we talked about with the market revolution now goes into fast forward, and you begin to see more strikes and labor strife up north. So they begin to lose attention, lose interest in the South somewhat. So by the early to mid 1870s, you begin to see a waning interest by Northern Republicans in Reconstruction of the South. All right. So, Roman numeral 3, the constitutional changes of the Reconstruction period embodied a Northern idea of American identity and national purpose and led to conflicts over new definitions of citizenship, particularly regarding the rights of African Americans, women, and other minorities. So, you can see that in the 14th and 15th Amendments, which were the Second and Third Reconstruction Amendments. All right, the 14th Amendment provided for automatic citizenship for anybody who's born here, regardless of color, race, yada yada. Equal protection under the law. Okay, that's the 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment was suffrage for African American males. Notably, women were left out. So that's the 14th and 15th Amendments. Now, subsequently, these rights were restricted through, first, segregation, Jim Crow laws. Notice that it says equal protection of the law. So segregation was separate but equal. So in 1896, you have the Supreme Court in the Plessy v. Ferguson case. Homer Plessy was an octoroon, 1/8 black, who rode in a white train car across state lines to test the law. And the Supreme Court in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson said, as long as it's equal, it's okay for it to be separate. So they found a roundabout way, a way around the 14th Amendment. All right. Also restricting this was the violence that you would see down south, the lynchings, thousands and thousands of lynchings during this nadir, N-A-D-I-R, of race relations from 1877 to 1930s. Intimidating African Americans, trying to prevent them from voting. All right, so that was their way around. These amendments also stipulated that you couldn't deny voting on the basis of race. So the South said, okay, we can't tell them they can't vote because they're black, We just won't say it out loud. We'll just stop them for using other ways. One way is we'll terrorize them. All right. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was intended to rectify this, to make all these roundabout ways to limit the right to vote, literacy tests and poll taxes, made all those things illegal. By the way, the most of this Voting Rights Act was repealed recently. All right. So, also you have Supreme Court decisions that limited these amendments. We have the famous civil rights cases. You should highlight this. That limited this by finding that individuals and private businesses could discriminate, meaning these civil rights cases said, the Supreme Court said, the national government does not have the right to tell a private business person who he or she can and cannot serve. You walk into a restaurant and they can say, we don't serve colored folks here. And the civil rights cases found that that's perfectly fine. The national government does not have the legal right to tell them. It's their own private business. They can't tell them. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was intended to change that. A private business owner, a diner owner, could not discriminate, even though it was private business. The national government by 1964 said, we do have the right to tell you that you have to serve that person. You can't say we're not going to serve you because you're black or because you're Jewish or whatever it is. Okay? So, again, that's the unfinished part that Foner was talking about. Alright. So, during Reconstruction, they passed these amendments, and in subsequent years, these amendments are watered down by subsequent legislation. Okay? And I'm not going to talk about this again, the Plessy v. Ferguson case, but this was eventually overturned by Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, that you couldn't segregate in schools, that the South fought for about 20 more years after that, which you will learn about in U.S. too. Also, don't forget other tactics I mentioned, poll taxes, charging black people a tax to vote, and also making them pass a test where if you got one question wrong, you failed. Very often the tests were verbal, so if you mispronounced a word, it was basically subjective. The person behind the registrar, behind the desk, behind the counter, giving you the test. You mispronounced it. I'm sorry, mispronounced. You failed. And also, please write down your name and your address and all this stuff, just for record-keeping purposes. We're not going to give it to anybody who might show up at your house later that night. So, these were all extra-legal ways to get black people to not vote down south. Alright? Alright, so the effect of the 14th and 15th Amendments on the women's rights movement. Alright? It divided the women's rights movement, these two amendments. Frederick Douglass and others favored black suffrage prior to women's suffrage, but women felt abandoned by this because they were not included in the 15th Amendment, yet they were an extremely significant part of the abolitionist movement. The feminist movement actually came out of the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement, by the way, is often looked at as kind of like the godfather of reform movements in this nation, and even globally speaking. Every time there's any type of protest movement or reform movement in this country and perhaps globally, historians always go back to the abolitionist movement and compare it to that movement. Alright, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony feared that women's suffrage would not be granted anytime soon, and they were right. It was, how many years later? When did women get the right to vote? 1920. Alright, so that's 55 years later they finally got it, so they were right, and they felt abandoned. Alright, there she is. There's Stanton. Alright, so although the 13th through 15th Amendments were restricted in the short term, they later would be used to uphold civil rights. Alright, so it's not a first. Eventually, the country gets it right. In the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, you have the civil rights movement, where many of the pieces of legislation that helped out that movement were built off of legislation you saw 100 years earlier during Reconstruction. Alright, so let's get to test tips. I'll just finish up here quickly. In the multiple choice or short answer question, things you might be asked about: reasons for the Union's victory in the war, ways the South resisted Reconstruction and its amendments, racial equality, how Reconstruction changed the relationship between Congress and the presidency. For the essay, you may be asked to connect Reconstruction amendments to civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. Again, this topic is ripe for that historical skill of continuity and change over time. All right. The political and social effects of Reconstruction on American society. All right. Ways that African American experience changes but also stayed the same from the pre-Civil War to Reconstruction to post-Reconstruction era. All right. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And also, please be sure to take the quiz that will pop up right now.